It happened in an instant, the kind of moment that makes the entire country stop what it's doing and lean in. Alan Dershowitz, the aging legal scholar who built his reputation on courtroom theatrics and cable news soundbites, leaned back in his chair, smirk curling across his face, and delivered the jab. With the dismissive cadence of a man who thought the cameras belonged to him, he mocked Jasmine Crockett, her voice, her passion, her very presence at the table. The air froze. The panel leaned forward. The insult had landed. Dershowitz chuckled as though he'd scored the clever point, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that has too often silenced women and people of color in America's public square. His words weren't just aimed at Crockett. They carried the smug assurance that the old guard still held the microphone, that he could reduce her to a caricature in front of a live audience. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her expression was measured, eyes steady, shoulders squared. Behind that calm exterior, though, something shifted. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. Viewers at home could almost feel it, the spark of someone who has been underestimated her whole life, now quietly calculating the strike that would flip the room on its head. Gasps rippled across the studio. A few panelists exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh along with Dershowitz or brace for what was coming. Social media, already buzzing, lit up instantly, clips clipped, hashtags forming, fans and critics sensing that history was about to write itself in real time. For Dershowitz, it was just another night of smirks and sound bites. For Crockett, it was something larger. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about defending every young woman told she didn't belong, every immigrant child mocked for speaking up, every underdog who had ever been sneered at by the so-called gatekeepers of power. And so she leaned forward, the silence stretching as millions of viewers leaned with her. The arrogance in Dershowitz's eyes didn't waver, but the stage was no longer his. It belonged to her now. What she said next would leave him speechless, and the entire country talking. The exchange didn't happen in the shadows of a committee room or the quiet of a university lecture hall. It unfolded under the glaring lights of primetime television, where millions tune in not just for facts but for spectacle. The show was one of those nightly panels that thrive on conflict, the kind of program where careers are made and destroyed in a single sentence. Every guest knew the stakes walking in: speak with authority, or be steamrolled on national television. For Alan Dershowitz, this was familiar ground. He'd spent decades perfecting his image as the sharp-tongued contrarian, the man who could out-argue almost anyone. His fans tuned in to see him dismantle opponents with legal jargon and rhetorical tricks. He relished the stage, certain that his reputation alone made him untouchable. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman whose name was only beginning to reach households across the country. She wasn't the legacy voice of academia or the polished darling of cable producers. She represented something else: raw authenticity, the grit of someone who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. The tension wasn't just political. It was generational. Cultural. A collision between the old guard of privilege and a new wave of unapologetic voices demanding their space at the table. From the moment Crockett was introduced, the energy shifted. Viewers could feel it. This wasn't going to be another predictable panel where Dershowitz dismissed a younger opponent with a smirk and the conversation moved on. There was a storm building. Every comment he lobbed, every attempt at condescension, only drew sharper contrasts. The audience at home wasn't just watching a debate, they were watching a symbolic clash of eras. And the stakes were higher than they appeared. For Crockett, the exchange wasn't simply about defending her ideas on policy. It was about representation. About showing millions of Americans who looked like her, who shared her struggles, that dignity and intellect could stand tall against arrogance, no matter how credentialed it claimed to be. Her composure under fire wasn't accidental. It was survival honed into skill. Inside the studio, that truth was palpable. Some panelists leaned forward, almost rooting for her silently, while others clung to the safety of neutrality. Out in the digital world, chat feeds and Twitter threads exploded with anticipation. Every second of silence between them felt like a drumbeat leading towards something unforgettable. Because everyone knew, whether they admitted it or not, that this clash wasn't about left versus right. It wasn't even about law versus politics. It was about power, who gets to wield it, who gets to define the conversation, and who finally gets to be heard. And in that moment, viewers weren't just spectators. They were participants, feeling the same nervous electricity that filled the studio air. A takedown here could echo far beyond the walls of television, resonating in classrooms, in workplaces, in dinner table conversations. Dershowitz believed he was playing the same old game. What he didn't realize was that the rules had changed. Crockett wasn't there to play defense. She was there to draw a line, and cross it without hesitation. To understand why Crockett's words hit like a thunderclap, we need to look closer at the man who tried to put her down. Alan Dershowitz was not always the punchline. Once he was the prodigy of Harvard Law, the brash young professor who built his brand on being smarter, sharper, and faster than anyone in the room. His students admired his quick wit and encyclopedic recall of constitutional law. Judges knew his name. Journalists lined up for his quotes. For decades, Dershowitz cultivated the aura of a man who could not be touched, a man whose intellect elevated him above ordinary politics, above criticism, above reproach. But somewhere along the way, the shine dulled. The celebrated professor became something else, a professional contrarian, a fixture of television panels where outrage mattered more than substance. He leaned into the role, trading scholarship for soundbites, principle for provocation. And while the world changed around him, Dershowitz clung to his old tricks, wielding them with the arrogance of someone convinced that the rules of consequence did not apply to him. His contradictions were his trademark. Here was a man who claimed to revere the law, yet repeatedly used his talents to defend the most controversial figures of his era. From O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein, Dershowitz seemed drawn to clients who embodied notoriety, insisting that his work was about the purity of legal defense, not morality. But to many watching, it felt like a pattern, Dershowitz standing shoulder to shoulder with the powerful and the disgraced, dressing up their sins in constitutional language, and walking away with his reputation intact. Critics called him shameless. Supporters called him fearless. But no one denied he was always in the spotlight, always ready to pivot from courtroom to cable studio, always the loudest voice in the room. He relished controversy, and controversy seemed to relish him back. Over time, however, the mask began to slip. The professor who once prided himself on intellectual rigor now relied on smirks and dismissive quips. The lawyer who lectured about due process turned into a pundit defending the indefensible. And with each appearance, he seemed less like the titan of law and more like a man desperately clinging to relevance in a world that had moved past him. Still, Dershowitz wore his arrogance like armor. He boasted of his connections, his accolades, his long career at Harvard. He reminded audiences that he had advised presidents, written bestsellers, debated world leaders. To him, these were shields against criticism, proof that he belonged on every stage, above every challenger. And as long as his opponents were easily rattled, the strategy worked. But the cracks were showing. Younger generations didn't see the towering scholar. They saw a man out of touch, lecturing with the entitlement of someone convinced his worldview was still gospel. His critics mocked him as a relic of a bygone era, yet Dershowitz never adjusted. If anything, he leaned further into the persona, convinced that smug certainty was the same as wisdom. Law is about principles, not popularity, he would insist, even as he turned each appearance into a performance tailored for the cameras. I don't care if I'm hated, I care if I'm right. The words sounded noble, but his actions told a different story. The man who defended the infamous, mocked the marginalized, and basked in the glow of his own bravado. Detached from the realities of ordinary people, Dershowitz treated debate like a sport, a stage for his ego rather than a forum for truth. For him, the point wasn't to listen, it was to dominate. Not to engage, but to dismiss. And as long as he could keep opponents stumbling, the illusion of invincibility held. But arrogance breeds blind spots. In that television studio, with cameras rolling and millions watching, Dershowitz thought he was facing another easy opponent, someone young, inexperienced, eager to spar with the so-called great mind. He smirked, he mocked, and he assumed the script would play out like it always had. He would walk away with the last word, and his opponent would be left flustered, humiliated, forgotten. What he didn't account for was Jasmine Crockett's steel. He didn't see the composure beneath her calm, the fire behind her measured gaze. He underestimated her the way powerful men have underestimated women of color for generations, and that was his fatal miscalculation. Because every empire of arrogance meets its challenger. Every self-crowned king eventually faces a reckoning, and Dershowitz's arrived in the form of a freshman congresswoman he underestimated. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Alan Dershowitz under the blinding lights of a television studio, she was fighting battles in rooms where the cameras never reached. She didn't come from the polished pipeline of Ivy League grooming or the old networks of wealth and influence. Her path was forged in the grit of real life, in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where every win had to be clawed out of thin air. Crockett was the daughter of working-class struggle, raised in a community where sacrifice was not an abstract concept but a daily necessity. Bills had to be juggled. Dreams had to be postponed. The margins were thin, and the safety nets often absent. She knew firsthand what it meant to scrape by, to feel unseen by systems designed for someone else. Yet instead of breaking her, those conditions hardened her. They gave her a fluency and resilience that no textbook could ever teach. Education wasn't easy, but it became her ladder. She fought her way through school with the same determination that would later define her political life, balancing jobs, navigating institutions not built for people like her, demanding to be taken seriously in rooms where her presence alone felt like an act of defiance. For every door that closed, she found a window. For every sneer or slight, she gathered more fuel. By the time she earned her law degree, she wasn't just armed with legal knowledge. She carried the lived experiences of people who rarely had an advocate speaking their language. As a young attorney, Crockett didn't chase prestige. She chose service. She took on cases that others ignored, eviction defenses, civil rights claims, the kind of legal work that pays little but matters immensely. She was the lawyer sitting at the kitchen tables of clients who couldn't afford much more than hope, translating the law into something they could cling to. Her office was sometimes a borrowed corner of a community center. Her paycheck often stretched too thin, but her resolve was unshakable. Those years gave her a clarity that polished insiders often lack. She saw how policy isn't just theory, it's whether a mother can keep a roof over her children's heads, whether a young man survives an unjust system, whether dignity can be preserved in a society that too often tramples it. Crockett didn't read about injustice, she represented it, stood next to it, and fought it case by case. When she entered politics, it wasn't out of ambition for titles. It was necessity. Too many of the problems she confronted in courtrooms stemmed from decisions made in capitals by people disconnected from reality. She knew that the fight needed to move upstream, to the very halls where laws were written and futures were shaped. And so she ran, against the odds, against the establishment, against the notion that a woman like her should wait her turn. Her campaign was not fueled by big donors or slick consultants. It was fueled by people who saw themselves in her story. Teachers tired of being underpaid, immigrants tired of being scapegoated, workers tired of being invisible. She knocked on doors, walked streets, shook hands until her voice was hoarse and her feet were blistered. And when she won, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement. It was proof that authenticity could break through, that resilience could outshine privilege, that someone who carried the voices of the unheard could make it inside the chambers of power. In Congress, Crockett quickly established herself not as a polished insider, but as a fighter. She spoke plainly, without the coded language of Washington. She refused to soften her edges to appease those who were more comfortable with complacency. She wore her identity openly, not as a liability but as a badge of honor, a reminder to every marginalized kid watching that their voice could not only enter the conversation but lead it. And that authenticity made her dangerous to the old guard. Because they couldn't box her in. They couldn't dismiss her as naive, because her knowledge was lived. They couldn't paint her as elitist, because her roots were undeniable. They couldn't intimidate her with credentials, because she had already survived challenges far greater than condescension. By the time she sat across from Alan Dershowitz, Crockett wasn't just another politician on a panel. She was the embodiment of a different America, an America that refuses to be mocked into silence, an America that insists dignity belongs to everyone, an America that has clawed its way through struggle and still stands tall. So when Dershowitz smirked and delivered his mocking line, he thought he was sparring with a rookie, a freshman out of her depth. What he didn't see was the lifetime of battles etched into her composure. He didn't hear the countless voices behind her steady tone. He didn't understand that for Crockett, this wasn't just about her pride, it was about the pride of every person who had ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to know their place. And it was this life experience that armed her with the words that no Harvard law professor could parry. Back in the studio, the tension was as sharp as broken glass. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward, gesturing with the authority of a man used to silencing opponents by sheer volume. He cut in over Crockett's words, his interruptions as relentless as they were dismissive. Each time she began to lay out her point, he barreled through with condescending laughter, shaking his head as though the very idea of her speaking with authority was absurd. "This is exactly the problem," he declared, wagging his finger. "People who don't understand the law trying to twist it for political theater." The jab wasn't just about policy, it was personal, a subtle but unmistakable attempt to brand her as ignorant, unworthy of the debate. The kind of tactic Dershowitz had perfected over decades. Diminish the opponent, puff yourself up, when not with reason but with ridicule. Crockett, however, did not rise to the bait. She kept her voice even, her posture steady, her eyes locked on him with a focus that unsettled more than it revealed. While Dershowitz spoke over her, she waited, not passive, but patient, storing the weight of every interruption, every insult. The audience in the studio picked up on it immediately. Gasps slipped out as Dershowitz grew bolder, his smirk widening with each interruption. One panelist shifted uncomfortably in their chair, glancing from Crockett to the host as if silently wondering whether anyone would step in. Another raised their eyebrows, half amused, half alarmed at Dershowitz's audacity. And at home, millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. They had seen this performance before, the older, powerful man laughing down a woman with less institutional weight, convinced that dominance was the same as intelligence. But something in Crockett's stillness suggested a storm was gathering. Dershowitz didn't notice. He plowed ahead, his tone increasingly smug. "You're out of your depth here, Congresswoman. You can't just shout slogans and call it law. This isn't activism, this is serious business, and some of us actually understand it." The insult hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A few chuckles trickled from sympathetic corners of the panel, but most of the room froze. Everyone could see Crockett's composure, the way she inhaled slowly, the way her gaze didn't waver even as the condescension thickened. It was the calm before impact, the kind of quiet that made people instinctively hold their breath. Dershowitz kept talking, filling the silence with the bravado of a man who believed he had already won. He quoted legal precedents, waved his resume like a weapon, invoked his years at Harvard as though they were the final word on every subject. Each boast was another brick in the wall of arrogance he built around himself, certain it would hold. But for those watching, the shift was clear. The more he talked, the more he revealed, not his brilliance, but his insecurity. Not his mastery, but his fear of being challenged by someone who didn't fit the mold he was used to defeating. His words grew louder, but their power grew smaller, shrinking under the weight of Crockett's unshaken calm. One by one, the smirks faded from the faces around the table. The gasps grew quieter, replaced by a taut silence. Even the host, who had initially allowed the sparring to continue unchecked, leaned in as though sensing that something far bigger than routine debate theater was about to unfold. Crockett finally shifted in her seat, just slightly, but enough to signal the change. The audience felt it instantly, the pivot, the moment when patience transforms into precision. She had absorbed the mockery, the interruptions, the arrogance, and now she was ready to return it with interest. Dershowitz smirked again, shaking his head as though she couldn't possibly muster anything of consequence. But the cameras caught it, the flicker in his eyes, the tiniest hesitation as he realized her silence had not been surrender. It had been strategy. And then came the pause, the kind of pause that draws every ear, every eye, every heartbeat into a single rhythm. Crockett leaned forward, her expression unchanging, her voice steady. The moment had arrived. Then came the moment no one saw coming, Crockett's clapback. It began with a single breath. Jasmine Crockett inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that makes a room hold its own, as if the very air recognized something monumental was about to happen. Her gaze was fixed, unbroken, a razor cutting through Dershowitz's smirk. For a moment, the panel froze in suspense, suspended between his last smug remark and her first calculated word. She started not with anger, but with precision. "Professor," she said evenly, her tone steady and deliberate. "You've spent a lifetime reminding people of how brilliant you are. But brilliance without humility isn't wisdom. It's arrogance." The words slid across the table like ice. Dershowitz blinked, the smile twitching on his lips. A ripple went through the audience, a sharp inhale, a whispered "oh," as they registered what was happening. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was the opening strike of something larger. Crockett pressed on, her voice unwavering. "You say I don't understand the law. But I've lived the consequences of the law. I've stood next to families evicted from their homes, young people railroaded by a system that was never built to protect them. You cite cases. I cite lives. And that's the difference." The sting landed. Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. Even the host, usually eager to interject, let the words hang in the air. Dershowitz shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering just enough for the cameras to catch it. And Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward now, not raising her voice, but sharpening it. "You've defended some of the most powerful and the most infamous men in America. You've made a career standing beside them, rationalizing their actions with your legal theories. But tell me, Professor, when was the last time you stood beside someone who didn't have wealth or power to protect them? When was the last time you put your brilliance to work for someone who couldn't afford it?" The room went still. A few panelists looked down at their notes, as if retreating from the crossfire. A studio assistant off-camera covered her mouth. On social media, clips of her words began flooding timelines, captions screaming, "Crockett destroys Dershowitz live on TV." Within seconds, hashtags bloomed, #SpeechlessProfessor, #CrockettClapback. Dershowitz opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but nothing came out. For the first time in recent memory, the man who prided himself on always having the last word was caught empty-handed. His bluster evaporated under the weight of her calm. Crockett continued, the tempo of her delivery perfectly measured. "You mock me because I'm new, because I'm young, because I don't have Harvard stamped on my resume. But what you don't realize is that your world, the one where power is hoarded and voices like mine are dismissed, is fading. And the people I represent, the ones you mock when you mock me, we're not going anywhere. We're here, and we're not asking for permission to speak." The sting deepened. The silence sharpened. And then, the crowd reaction. Gasps, nervous laughter, the sound of tension breaking into stunned awe. The cameras zoomed in on Dershowitz, his lips pressed together, his eyes narrowing as though searching desperately for the clever line that would restore his dominance. But it never came. Because Crockett's words weren't just about him. They were about everyone watching who had ever felt dismissed, ignored, belittled. Her voice carried the resonance of generations told to wait their turn. Her words were more than argument, they were vindication. Twitter erupted. "She just buried him. Crockett is the future. Harvard can't teach what life taught her." Memes circulated almost instantly, Dershowitz's stunned face paired with captions like "when the student schools the professor" and "speechless" in 4K. And yet Crockett's voice never rose. Her words never shook. And that made them hit even harder. She drove the final point with surgical precision. "You think this is about credentials. It's not. It's about credibility. And tonight, Professor, you showed America the difference." The studio audience burst, not in cheers, because it wasn't that kind of show, but in the kind of involuntary exclamations that live television cannot contain. Gasps, murmurs, even applause from corners where restraint had broken. One panelist, unable to stop himself, whispered audibly into his mic, "Wow." And there sat Alan Dershowitz, the man who built a career on never being silenced, suddenly speechless. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the host, at the panelists, at the floor. For the first time in decades, the arrogance seemed to drain, replaced by the unmistakable look of someone who had been caught off guard, unprepared, and undeniably outmatched. Crockett leaned back in her chair, not with triumph but with calm finality. She had said what needed to be said, and she didn't need to gild it with gloating. Her composure was the victory. Her restraint was the exclamation point. The cameras caught every detail: Dershowitz's flushed face, the host fumbling to shift to commercial, the panelists whispering to each other, unable to mask their disbelief. It was the kind of television moment that doesn't just air, it echoes. Because this wasn't just a takedown. It was a shift. A rebalancing. The moment when arrogance collided with authenticity, and arrogance lost. But if Dershowitz thought the humiliation ended there, he was wrong. The aftershocks were only beginning. The clash didn't end when the cameras cut. In many ways, it was only beginning. Within minutes of the broadcast, Twitter feeds detonated into a digital bonfire. Clips of Crockett's takedown spread like wildfire, each post punctuated with flames, clap emojis, and the unmistakable phrase that defined the night. Speechless. Hashtag shot up the trending charts. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag speechless professor. Hashtag future of politics. Meme makers wasted no time. Dershowitz's stunned face was plastered onto everything from courtroom dramas to boxing posters, the caption always the same. Down goes the professor. Side-by-side images showed Crockett leaning forward with calm precision next to Dershowitz mid-bluster, the contrast too perfect for the internet to resist. But it wasn't just jokes. The energy was different. Ordinary people, watching from living rooms, buses, dorm rooms, and kitchens, felt like they had seen something that mattered. One viral tweet read, "Finally, someone stood up to arrogance and didn't blink. This is what representation looks like." Another, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us who've been dismissed, mocked, and told to wait our turn." The reaction snowballed across platforms. TikTok montages stitched her calm rebuttal with motivational music, capturing millions of views in hours. Instagram Reels paired her lines with quotes from historical icons. Even Facebook, often slower to catch cultural lightning, buzzed with older audiences marveling at the poise she displayed. Pundits scrambled to respond. Progressive commentators hailed the moment as the passing of the torch, calling Crockett's composure and clarity the antidote to decades of smug gatekeeping. One headline declared, "Crockett shows America how to win without shouting." On the other side, conservative analysts tried to downplay it, claiming Dershowitz was caught off guard, or didn't want to stoop to her level. But the excuses fell flat. The video spoke for itself, and no spin could erase the image of a man who prided himself on never losing an argument, staring helplessly as the floor disappeared beneath him. Even fellow lawmakers took notice. Colleagues tweeted their praise. "Jasmine Crockett just showed us how it's done." A senator wrote, "That's not just a clapback, that's leadership." Behind closed doors, aides whispered about how the exchange had vaulted Crockett's name into conversations about rising stars within the party. And beyond politics, there was resonance. Teachers shared the clip with their students as an example of composure under pressure. Parents showed their children, saying, "This is how you face down a bully." For many immigrants and working-class Americans, the moment felt like validation, proof that dignity could triumph over arrogance, even in the most hostile arenas. Meanwhile, Dershowitz's defenders struggled to find footing. Some claimed the clip was edited unfairly. Others insisted that his decades of scholarship still carried more weight than a single viral moment. But their words rang hollow, drowned out by the roar of digital applause for Crockett. For every attempt to defend him, 10 more posts mocked his silence, replaying the moment he blinked, stuttered, and came up empty. The contrast was stark. On one side, passion, excitement, a sense of collective victory. On the other, weak rationalizations and weary nostalgia for a time when men like Dershowitz went unchallenged. The cultural tide was obvious. News shows replayed the exchange on loop, anchors marveling at the composure Crockett maintained. Late-night hosts joined in, weaving the takedown into monologues that left audiences laughing and cheering. The clip crossed demographics, shared not just among political junkies but among people who rarely followed these debates. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about the raw satisfaction of watching dignity silence arrogance. And for Crockett, it wasn't just a viral win. It was a moment of arrival. Her name, once unfamiliar to many, now trended alongside words like powerful and inspiring. She became a symbol, her image etched into the collective memory, as the congresswoman who faced down the unfaceable and won. But the deeper resonance was yet to be explored. Because while the internet laughed, memed, and celebrated, something beneath the surface was shifting. Crockett's words weren't only a clapback. They carried weight, history, and truth that echoed beyond the viral headlines. And that deeper truth was about to come into focus. But beyond the viral headlines, there was something deeper about Crockett's words that resonated. What made Jasmine Crockett's words so unforgettable wasn't just the sting they left on Alan Dershowitz. It was the way they broke free from the narrow cage of a television debate and soared into something larger, something deeply human. This wasn't merely a clash of talking heads. It was a story of dignity confronting arrogance, of truth pushing back against condescension, of a new voice refusing to bow to the weight of old privilege. Because when Crockett spoke, she wasn't just defending herself. She was giving voice to everyone who has ever been told to wait your turn, to tone it down, to know your place. Her calm refusal to shrink in the face of mockery carried with it the force of generations who had endured the same. The applause that followed wasn't just about clever phrasing or political savvy. It was about the release of something pent up, a collective sigh of relief that finally, someone had said what so many had always wanted to say. Her victory on that stage was not loud, not brash, not cruel. It was steady. It was clear. And that is why it rang out so powerfully. In an era where shouting often drowns out substance, Crockett proved that composure can be stronger than bluster, that restraint can cut deeper than rage. She reminded us that true power doesn't come from volume, it comes from conviction. The lesson reached far beyond Washington. For immigrants working long hours to carve out a future, Crockett's defiance was proof that the system could still be challenged. For young women of color stepping into boardrooms, classrooms, or courtrooms, her calm clapback was a beacon: you belong here, no matter who tries to push you out. And for every ordinary American who has been dismissed, ignored, or mocked for daring to speak their truth, her composure was a promise that dignity will not be silenced. Democracy itself rests on that principle. It is not just about laws and votes. It is about voices, whose are heard, and whose are ignored. For too long, figures like Dershowitz had treated the public square as their personal stage, assuming their credentials gave them the right to dominate. But democracy demands something different. It demands the courage to confront arrogance with honesty, to refuse to be belittled into silence. In that studio, Crockett embodied that ideal. And in doing so, she reminded us of what resilience looks like. It's not the absence of struggle, it's the decision to keep standing, even when the world tries to shove you down. It's not about never being mocked, it's about answering mockery with grace so undeniable that it leaves your critics speechless. That is why her words resonated far beyond the instant memes and headlines. They tapped into a hunger for justice, not the courtroom kind Dershowitz had long championed, but the deeper justice of recognition and respect. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. They didn't just laugh at the professor's silence, they saw in it a glimmer of something larger, a world where arrogance finally meets its match, and where truth, spoken plainly, prevails. And that is the heart of Crockett's moment. It was never just about winning an argument. It was about proving that democracy still has the capacity to surprise us, to elevate the unexpected, to give a microphone to the underestimated and let them speak with the full force of their lived truth. Her clapback was a reminder that the American story is not written solely by the powerful. It is written by those who rise again and again, when told not to. It is carried forward by those who believe that service is stronger than status, that humility outshines hubris, and that dignity, real, hard-earned dignity, will always outlast arrogance. And it was this life experience, this resilience woven into her very being, that armed Jasmine Crockett with the words no Harvard law professor could parry. Alan Dershowitz walked into that studio certain of the outcome. He mocked, he dismissed, he leaned on decades of reputation. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. With a single, poised clapback, she turned the tables, and left one of America's most famous legal minds utterly speechless. That moment wasn't just a television highlight. It was a parable about power. About how arrogance, no matter how polished, always crumbles in the face of dignity. About how truth, spoken plainly, will always cut deeper than condescension dressed up as intellect. Crockett's composure showed us what strength really looks like. Not the strength of shouting louder. Not the strength of puffing up credentials. But the strength of standing tall, rooted in lived experience, and refusing to be diminished. That's what millions saw that night. That's what resonated long after the cameras stopped rolling. And if there's one lesson we take from it, it's this: arrogance never wins in the end. What endures is respect. What inspires is courage. What moves us forward is the quiet but unshakable dignity of voices like Jasmine Crockett's. So if you believe in moments like this, if you want to see more stories of everyday resilience triumphing over privilege, if you want to amplify the voices that cut through the noise, then don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Subscribe. Share this story. Tell your friends that arrogance can be challenged, that dignity deserves the microphone, and that America is strongest when voices like Jasmine Crockett's are heard loud and clear. Because this wasn't just her victory. It was a reminder to all of us: when truth speaks with courage, arrogance has no reply.